The phrase evidence-based approach or scientific approach quite often gets thrown around, I think sometimes a little bit too lightly. So what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss my thoughts on what it means to actually take a scientific or evidence-based approach to your training and really discuss the continuum of what that means. There's a lot of extremes, either end of you must do this or you must do that, and a lot of the time we sort of get too polarized here. So what I want you to do, grab yourself a coffee. Today's coffee thought is, what does it actually mean, from my perspective, to take an evidence-based approach to your preparation and training? So without any further ado, let's jump into it. All right, welcome back to another Coffee Thoughts installment, if you like. Today we're talking about what an evidence-based approach means for me. As we said in the initial Coffee Thoughts episode, this is not necessarily right or wrong. This is not a recommendation to do or not to do. We're just thinking of some ideas and talking through, really opening up a discussion point around a particular topic when it comes to training, sports science, endurance performance, all of that. So we're talking about evidence-based approach. And now this phrase gets thrown around quite a bit when it comes to sports performance training, particularly the endurance world, of what does that actually mean? What are we doing when we take an evidence-based approach to our training philosophy, our performance, our racing, etc. Realistically, when you break it down, I think there's two main schools of thought when it comes to this, and often they're quite polarized. There's the group that are very scientific and very literature focused, look at the articles, read the latest research, and just try and directly implement that, and that's the only way to go about it. There's the second group on the other side of the spectrum, though, that are very much don't worry about the research because this is what works. This is what works in the field. We don't maybe fully know why it works, but I've seen it work, or it worked for me, so it must work for you. There's that other side of it that's purely just applied, practical, and doesn't disregard the science, so to speak, but maybe doesn't necessarily keep up with the latest up-to-date information that's coming out from the scientific research world. They're sort of the polar opposite ends of the spectrum. What I'm going to do is going to quickly talk about both ends of those, and then talk about where I sort of sit on that in terms of what my evidence-based approach actually looks like. So first and foremost, the scientific side. Looking at research articles and understanding the theory and underpinning of what human performance is and means, the physiology, all of that stuff, absolute must-know information. And I think it's a really important part of the process to continue to investigate human performance and what are the limits, what are we improving, how are we doing that. The research is really, really critical. The thing we have to be really careful about, though, is that research sometimes isn't always telling us exactly what to do in the field. And the reason is because you're going to be limited. Ultimately, from a research perspective, a bit of a goal is to try and limit all the external factors, or limit as many factors that might influence a result as possible, so you know exactly where the outcome is coming from. That would be an ideal scenario, is like, this is what we thought, this is what we set out to do, and this was the result. Research obviously isn't that simple all the time, because we might not know what the outcome is going to be, or we might think it might go in one direction, it goes another. And so ultimately some of the insights we take from the literature might not fully apply. And often that comes in the form of, what was the population? What was this population sample in that study? Was it elite athletes? Was it amateur athletes? Were they untrained or trained to begin with? That's a classic one. If you're an untrained person jumping into that research study, you do 6 weeks of strength training, you're going to expect to be stronger at the end of it. And that happens all the time in the research. A similar example to that, where we just take an untrained person, we give them anything and they become better as a result of just training in the first place. That finding is not going to translate to the triathlete who's been racing and training for 10 plus years. The other things as well that we have to be mindful of is, who might be funding the study? Was it independent research done by someone, or was it a company? And a great example of this is someone at the Gatorade Institute, based in the US, do lots of research on sports nutrition and hydration, and some of the stuff that comes out of it is great. But at the end of the day, they're selling a hydration product. So if there was a bit of information that was really pushing a particular formulation of a fluid you need to take during your racing, and that just so happened to match up exactly with a new product, I'm going to have a bit of skepticism around, are they just trying to sell something here, or is that research actually legitimate? So you need to look further past just that initial look. That also goes for just the journal that's publishing it. At the end of the day, these journals are effectively like magazines. They're going to put out the research that gets clicks and views, ultimately, is one of their focuses, because they have to make money somehow. But sometimes A study that doesn't show any effect, maybe it's a really great study because we want to know that there was no effect from a training method or a particular strategy, might not get published, but the one that had a bit of a dodgy twist on it gets published because people like to see results. They want to know if there was an improvement, they want to then be able to test and use that. So that's where, from a publishing perspective, sometimes the good stuff might actually get left unpublished and we don't actually find out about it. So we've got to be careful around that space. There's a lot of positives to the research and the scientific side, but there are some negatives too. If we flip all the way over to the other end of the spectrum though, and we start to look at, well, let's not look at journal articles at all. Let's just purely look at what happens in the real world, so to speak, and more anecdotal evidence. So what is my experience of things happening, whether that be scientifically or proven or otherwise? That's where there's a lot of positives out of that too. I mean, even something simple as asking an athlete, how do you feel? That is on the anecdotal evidence end of the spectrum. That's not me reading a journal article to understand how they feel. That's asking them individually, like, what is your feeling around how hard that session was, or how fatigued are you? We can get some great insight from that type of information. Going out and trying things and saying, go out and try this session, let's see what happens, and let's track that over time. That's a good experimental process to have. It may not have anything to do with any research we've done previously. We're just going and testing an idea that we've had. I really like that approach. If we're only looking at it that way though, and we're not making informed decisions on that, that's where we can start to get in a trap of, well, if it worked for me, then it must work for everyone else. And we're playing a bit of a guessing game. We're not fully sure of why things might have happened or why we might have experienced an improvement in our performance as a result of a particular training strategy. But we know it gave us a benefit, so it must work for someone else. That's a bit misguided because it's not going to happen. The classic case is someone like an ex-professional athlete who was quite successful. They might have had amazing endurance genetics. Let's say they're an Ironman triathlete. They might have had amazing endurance genetics and done years and years of training. Their training strategy and methodology clearly worked for them. Great, big tick in the box. But trying to bring that down and apply that to the everyday amateur who doesn't have the genetics, who doesn't have the motivation or the time to train, etc., probably isn't the best way of going about it. That's where that anecdotal only is a little bit hard to sit with on its own. So ultimately, what do? Well, I look more in the middle. And what I mean by in the middle is, yes, we want to be interested in what happens in the research and literature. And this is coming from people trained in the sports science realm. But it's like, yes, we need to understand that. We need to keep up to date, and we need to challenge our thinking around what we might think works or doesn't, look at different ideas, and that's ultimately where we're getting them from. But then when we take that into the real world, we need to make the appropriate manipulations or changes to get it to actually work in real life. Probably the nicer way to look at it is what we call applied sports science, is let's balance out what happens in a very controlled, researchy environment and what happens in the chaos of the real world, bring those two worlds a bit closer together. And that's all we're sort of doing. And ultimately, that's what I think of when I think of an evidence-based approach, is taking all the information available to us, anecdotal all the way through to literature, scientific, peer-reviewed research, looking at all the available information, bringing that together and collating that in a way that makes sense for the individual case study. So that really is the best way to think about an evidence-based approach, in my opinion. So hopefully I've opened up the discussion for you around this sort of topic. Again, another coffee thought. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. Doesn't mean it's a recommendation of what you should or shouldn't do, as I said at the start. I just want to start a conversation here by throwing out some of these ideas, and this is one I've had recently. So let me know your thoughts down below. What end of the spectrum do you tend to lean a bit more towards? I'd probably say I'm a bit more towards the scientific side than the anecdotal side. But like I said, I like that little balance point in between. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments and what you're thinking around this discussion. I really appreciate all the support we've been getting on the channel, so continue to subscribe and like these videos. And I'm going to challenge you to pass this video on to someone that you think might be interested in joining the conversation as well. I'm going to finish off this coffee. You go finish off yours. We'll look forward to doing another one of these soon, and we'll see you in the next one.